So I'm continuing a little section here because what I wanted to do was to do I asked you guys kind of some questions you wanted to have answered. And what I found is that I could answer most of those questions if I took little snapshots of different times, if we took the moment to understand what was really going on. Sometimes history is, people just look at the history and they see little names. They say, oh, and they come up with a terminology. Like, the term Lutheran was, people made an argument against Lutherans. What Lutheran is more than that. Or whatever, a certain group in history. It becomes just a detached name or an ideology. But these are people, and these are family. These are people who had real significance. And everything's flowing through history. Like, I wanted to throw this in. You guys have probably seen this picture before. Mm-hmm. This is a very famous picture. They're working on, I think it's the Empire State Building. And you see all the workers are sitting on the post. And this is used as representative of workers at that time working on the Empire State Building. But it's a staged picture, you know that? Workers did not do that. You know how one way you can tell? Look at what he's got in his hand right here. He's got a liquor bottle. It's a completely staged picture, but history has said this is real. And when you look it back, it was a Photoshop shoot for a magazine talking about workers and unions. That's actually what the picture is from. In the context of it, I had no idea until I was looking for pictures that had to do with taken out of context. Well, sometimes church history can be very much taken out of context. This is a statement that came up, and I want to talk about the image of the church that was developing and that the early church had, coming from, and that Augustine specifically talked about. Have you guys ever heard of the term? They love to use these big phrases in history and theology. Totus Christus. Have you ever heard that phrase? Or total Christ? I have one in the back. I see that hand. I've always wanted to say that. My church was small. It was actually only to hold about 40 people in it, in the place. And what it is a concept of Christ. The church is the body of Christ. And so how do we understand Christ is that we have to, when we see his body and how it functions, we are seeing a part of Christ. We can't understand, I'm not saying this poorly, but you can't understand Jesus unless you understand his people as well. That he is part. The church is his bride, and he is one with his church. It's not just there's Jesus and then there's a bunch of Christians. Is that there is a combination, and this idea of the unity of the church and of the oneness we have with Christ, that he is the head of the church, is not meant to be just an idea. That Christ is the head of his church. And Cyprian was a bishop in Carthage. Now, Carthage is in North Africa, and you might have heard of Carthage because the Romans had a big series of wars with Rome, and that's kind of what gave them their power when they gained control of the Mediterranean by destroying the Carthaginians. Well, Carthage was a major center of Christianity. Most of the early leaders, Augustine and Cyprian, and many of the people who controlled or were very influential in the church, came from North Africa, that or Rome. Now, it wasn't that Rome was the center. Especially early on, North Africa, as well as parts of France, were very influential in the church, especially the West. Well, what Cyprian says here is no one can have God for his father who does not have the church for his mother. Now, this was meant to be a teaching against the Gnostics and the Docetists, the people who said that Jesus wasn't real, and these different groups who said that you can have a personal relationship with Jesus without actually attending church. Now, you've probably heard that today. People talk about that today. And he had whole books written on this, Cyprian. This is 200 AD, when he's talking about the people who were starting to divide the church and saying, well, are we really one church? And he says, no. You can't think like that. You can't know God. You can't know Jesus unless you're at peace with the church. Now, does that mean you agree with everything that people say? He said, not say no. You don't have to agree with everything. But the unity goes deeper than that because we are all brothers and sisters. We are all one with Christ. And that has to mean something. So unless you're willing to be part of the church, then you can't really say you know God either. And those are pretty strong words. But this is what was the feeling of the day. People were, if you're a Roman, you were a Roman. It's not like now where people say, well, I'm an American, but what does that mean? They could say, well, I'm from Florida. Well, what political party do you have? Where did you go to school? Are you Christian? And everybody has these little subsects of division and individuality. Everybody is a snowflake, to use the term. Everybody's unique. Well, not back then. They didn't have that idea. You were either part of it or you weren't. Now, you can have division. You can talk. You can fight within your family. That's okay, as long as you're in the family. You stay in the family. They had that idea, kind of like in the movies The Godfather, is that you can have opposition within the family. The Roman culture was very much like the Godfather movies, the mob movies, is that you have the person on top and you got all the other people. But as long as you keep it in the family, it's okay. That was how the culture worked. You keep it in the family. And the church had some of that characteristic because it was part of the culture. So those who separate themselves from the visible church community, not talking about just some idea of the church, the actual visible community, due to disagreements or dissatisfaction, they are effectively separate themselves from true knowledge and relationship with God. This is how they viewed it. You can't understand this time if you don't understand that. And I think it's to some degree true today even, is that if you're not willing to learn with other believers and be part of a community and grow, you're not really knowing God. You're kind of being stuck in an infantile state. You have to grow with people. I use the term that says God saves people into communities. He doesn't save you just into yourself. He brings you into a community. And how they saw it was when a person becomes baptized, you are baptized, if you put it, into the church, into your community. It might just be your 3 friends or the 3 people you know in your community, but you're part of this group. It is like a giant ark. It's a boat that is keeping you safe. You get into the boat, and now you row like everyone else. You still are responsible to be part of it. But that's how they viewed the church and the world. You take part. You might not like the person next to you, but you still row. You do your job. So they were working through, well then, what does this boat believe and how does it run? Once you start getting lots of people joining a group, you really have to come up with rules. What does this ark look like? And we talked about in the past that they had started to develop these points of discipline, obedience, sacrifice. Discipline, you do what you're supposed to do because now you're a new creature. You're a creation that is designed for good works. There's a discipline that's required. There's an obedience both to your leaders, because this is not a game. This is something that's serious. And there's sacrifice, meaning you're to get rid of that which hinders you. It was a very dedicated organization. The church was not, nominalism was not at all acceptable. If you just think about that, the whole church, nominalism was never acceptable. And compromises were never, ever allowed. That's how they saw themselves. this was a common theme that you will find from, like, they saw, the early church, especially those in North Africa, viewed this passage as referring to them. They claimed it. They said, this is us. And they said, and they overcame him, the beast, by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death. They were being persecuted. They were being killed. They were being put on racks. They were being put on crosses. They were being killed and tortured. And they said, we are not going to give in. And there was a very strong resistance movement, if you want to put it, not just to we stand for Christ, but against authority, against the state. Because it's the state who is hunting you down. There was fear. There was this attitude of these are the people who are killing us. They have complete power. We are powerless. We can't feed our families. We can't run fast enough because everywhere we go, they will kill us. There's fear. If you can understand that. And they said, but we will overcome. You notice it says, and they overcame him. This was a mantra that was used by, especially in North Africa, of why they resisted. They said they would win. But what if a person, while they are on the rack, say, just stop. And they asked them to stop torturing them and said, I will say anything you want. What about them? Are they saved? According to this passage, if you take it just the way they understood it here, it says, and they overcame him. So if a person, for any reason, gave in to the state, whether that's getting the ability to buy or sell, whether that was conforming in any way to Roman culture, or giving in to torture, they saw you gave in. You're not a Christian. And they were very strict. There is no going back. And they said, using this passage, what I'm doing is I'm quoting from the text used by people in North Africa. It says, these are ones that they referred to a lot. It says, for in the case of those, these are from Hebrews 6. We're going to come to that in a few weeks, or a month or so. For in the case of those who have once been enlightened and have tasted of the heavenly gift and have been made partakers of the Holy Spirit and have tasted the good word of God and the powers of the age to come, believers, that's what it is, and then have fallen away, it is impossible to renew them again to repentance. If you're talking about people who have now given into torture, people who have perhaps stolen something, even as simple as that, according to how they were understanding this passage, they said they can't be let back into the Christian church. They must be shoved away. You should have nothing. They should be put away. They had a very strong mentality. If there was a person who had struggled with sin, either you succeed and we will be with you, otherwise you will be removed and we will have nothing to do with you. And there was very much a forceful attitude of you don't sin because this is what's going to happen. You are going to be put out. Very much like you would find in the old colony Mennonites when they would shun. A person is caught in sin and they are kicked right out of the group. There's no more joining. There's no more fellowship. You can't have dinners with people. You can't wave to them on the street because they're not going to talk to you. You're dead. They actually said, and they used language that said, if a person has sinned or has given into torture for any level, they are dead, is the language that they used. It is as if they have died. They came up with special words. Those who succeeded were called confessors. Ones who were tortured to death, or ones who were tortured and the guys gave up on torturing them. They were called confessors, and they were people who were given high-ranking positions in the church, because these were strong and they actually believed in God. Those who fell were called the lapsed. Those who recanted under torture. They said they're the lapsed, and you have nothing to do with them. See, there's an issue that starts coming up. What if, just because Pastor Mark isn't here, I was going to use him anyways, Pastor Mark is captured, and they torture him, and maybe he tells them where the church is. Under torture, in the Babel, he tells, and so they show up the next week. He is the leader of the church. What do you do with that? Because how they viewed succession within the early church is this idea of an apostolic succession. They laid hands on their leaders. And it goes from one generation, from the apostles to the next generation. We're talking only 200 years in here. They're still laying hands on people. They're still friends with, they know people who have known John the Baptist at this time. They're dead now, but they're within a generation or two. They're laying hands on people. Now, if this person, you've given in to torture, they said, well, a true believer doesn't give in. That means you weren't saved, and anybody that you have baptized probably isn't saved either. Because how can unbelief be given to, or faith be given to, how can you present faith to somebody if you were never faithful to begin with? See, this is a logical step. And they started to say that now pastors who gave in especially, or bishops, or gave in any way, that there could be this falling away of everyone who was under them. Because a pastor, well, can he truly be preaching Christ if he didn't know Christ? See, the bishops, the pastors were the gatekeepers. That you came, if you had a problem, you went to them. Because they're the ones who studied the Bible, who had hands laid on them, who knew from the guys before them, especially when everybody else is being persecuted and everybody's in hiding. You go to your leaders. You go to your elders. No one else, you couldn't guarantee that they actually knew the truth, especially with all the other little cults around. And then we have this other group called the traditors. These were the worst of the worst. If you notice that word, the traditors, looks very much like traitor, and that's actually the root word of traitor. This was people who, at some point, when being tortured, they gave either the Word of God, Christian books, the names of somebody, or where a church was. If they did one of those things, they were they are worse than dead. They are the worst kind of people. They are the betrayers of the faith, betrayers of the church. When you're being hunted by the Romans and you cannot count on your brother, your sister in the faith to not turn you in, can you imagine the fear? The fear that somebody might give in under torture? The constant fear that they were under. And the effect that this would have on their psyche. The whole church was designed of how the names that they used and the way it was done was don't give in to torture. We don't even think like that anymore. They had years that people were trained before they were allowed to have the Eucharist. Often between 2 and 3 years, you had to be trained before you could have a communion. Before they could trust you to be part of the group, to come in with a special group of people who were now doing communion. It wasn't something that everybody was allowed to do. And Cyprian says, no one can have God for his father who doesn't have the church for his mother. And it began to pull the church and giving power and authority, trying to pull the church together. And it started to kind of feed in on itself a little bit. You see, there were some people who thought they were being really gracious in this time period. And you have in First Clement, he was a bishop of Rome, as well as in the Shepherd or Moss. They said, if a person were to, let's say, just recant their faith in torture or commit a minor sin, such as thievery, there's a second chance. We might let you in once. Otherwise, you're completely left out. This is what Tertullian, as an example, says what you should do, what this meant. It says, this is what the lapsed are required to do if they were to fall into sin. It says, to lie in sackcloth and ashes, to cover his body in mourning, to lay his spirit low in sorrows, to exchange for severe treatment of the sins which he has committed. So do physical things to him. Moreover, to know no food or drink, but such as is plain, not for the stomach's sake, to wit, but the soul's, for the most part, however, to feed prayers on fastings, to groan, to weep, to make cries unto the Lord your God, to bow before the feet of the presbyters. So you have to beg forgiveness from the church. That's not to kneel to God's dear ones, to enjoin on all the brethren to be ambassadors to bear his deprecatory supplication before God. So basically, to beg other Christians to pray for you. That is what required. Now, this wasn't a one-time thing. They would often make this person do this for 2 to 3 years. That's how serious they were of removing. This was not just one group. This was North Africa, but especially around Rome as well, anywhere where there were severe persecution. This was kind of a general rule that was developing. Those who resisted sin or held to a very strict view of this, not allowing any forgiveness, they called themselves the Catharoi. It means the pure ones. They said, God, obviously, they are true because they have not given into torture. Now, I try to present this, and I want to describe, because I think this is something that we can fall into this very easy. And that's why I've spent some time on it. The Catharoi called themselves the pure ones. You should know, if you look at church history, any group that calls themselves pure or white or holy are always heretics. Always. Because of the sin of pride. Yeah. And then we have, I want to tell the story here. There was a guy named, during the persecution, there was a guy named Felix. He was the bishop of Rome. And he was captured by the Romans, and they tortured him, and he was released and died. And it left a vacancy in now who is in charge of Rome. And so Novatian saw an opportunity. He said the church is becoming staggered. It's becoming cracked under persecution. And he jumped into the leadership. And he took control of the Church of Rome and said, we need to be strong, and we have to not give in to torture, not give in. And he started really pushing the Catharoi creed in Rome. Well, the rest of the church saw his calls for this extreme, never forgive, never give in. Must be the pure ones in all things. And that's where we started the term Catholic. If you want to know where things begin, it was at this very moment. It was those who were resisting the Catharoi. That group is now the Catholics, the majority believers who said, no, this isn't right. And this group, they had another guy who had apostolic succession. He had the hands of the guy who had died, had baptized him, and they chose, his name is Fabian. I love that name. It's like Fabio. Fabian. I always see the guy with locks whenever I see this name. And he came in and he deposed Novatian and said, no, the Novatian, you did not have apostolic succession. You just took control. Thank you for taking control when there was no leader. Now we're in charge. Novatian didn't like that. And so he was forced to leave, and he kind of went, and he and his followers moved to North Africa. That's one thing North Africa did not need, was another leader like this. Then, now, here's the thing. People sometimes don't link this, except when you look on the historians, is that Novatianism and the group I'm going to talk about next, people always say, oh, they have remarkably similar ideas. Well, they said they were linked. Novatian had his followers go to North Africa, and then we have this guy named Cecilian. Cecilian was a presbyter from Rome who was going to be sent to North Africa in order to take control of that church when their leader died. And the followers of Novatian said, no, you know what? Felix, the guy who died a long time ago, when he died, he only got let out of jail because he gave books away. He gave Christian books. That would put him into the camp of the bad group. What are the Tradadors. And so then, as he so they said, so that means that Cecilian cannot become a bishop because that whole line is an incorrect group. So Cecilian was then, they came and said, no, we're not going to let him do the king. And the guy that they replaced him with was a guy named Donatus Magnus. All accounts is that he was not a horrible guy, and he also wasn't really big in history. He was only used as a history uses him because his name was there. The Donatists. These are people who are Novatianists, and they had this really strict view. And what they did is they started to depose other ministers because they said since Cecilian was false, then they started removing all the pastors, anybody that was connected with him. They started saying that anybody who was baptized by them were no longer believers, and they basically took their churches over, sometimes by force, removing the pastors, kicking them out, and there were lots of violence against the Catholics, beating them up in the streets because they were not believers. They were ones who were baptized by people who were no longer accepted. Now, this is the church, by the way. I'm just trying. This is the church doing this. That's how serious. These people were, had just going through persecution. Now we're talking about a generation or two later. These are the children of those who have died doing this. The same people's children. Yes?
So I was wondering, you're talking about pastors. Now, weren't these children or churches back in those days elder-led? So there was like a group of elders. I know that.
Yes, presbyters or yeah.
So it wasn't just one person, right?
No, often there would be a group,
Yeah.
but there might be a head.
Okay.
I think in Rome, because of their style, they tend to have a head pastor or a head elder. The word pastor, all these words are usually interchangeable. I'm sorry if I'm just trying to modernize the language a little bit, but you're right. I think presbyteros is the term. So Donatus Magnus was the leader that was put in. He began to kick people out. And he would say, how can wheat and tares coexist? And he says, can the baptism of a tare convey salvation if the person's not even saved? These are now his quotes. The polluted cannot cleanse the soil. The faithless cannot convey faith. Now, it's easy to sit there and get all angry about this, but think, what if you had a person who came in from the United Methodist Church wearing their rainbow garb, start baptizing people in your church, and you would say, well, are they truly saved? Or are they, what's the doctrines that they're holding to? Well, that's what they're doing here. Is they're saying these guys can't be true because obviously somebody has messed up. In fact, the Caecilians had basically said all along, actually what he did in order to save his life, yes, he did save his life. He gave them all the, like the Gospel of Thomas and stuff like that, the things that were heretical books. That's what he said. He told people from the beginning that's what he did. But because the Gospel of Thomas is not a holy book. It was a heretic. And he admitted that. And so they were still using that against as a way of gaining power. Meanwhile, remember this is a section, if you notice at the top it says Augustine of Hippo. Meanwhile, at this time, Augustine, the person involved in all this is what's happening in North Africa. And he has been saved in Rome and by Ambrose, and he's being trained up as a leader. And all he wants to do, being a speaker, being actually at one point, being called the voice of the emperor, the name that it was his job to speak and debate on behalf of the emperor. He had a very prominent role, but he didn't want to be that prominent role anymore. He wanted to go back to Carthage, to Hippo, and write books and learn about Christianity and teach other people. And then as soon as he gets back there, he finds this situation happening. And one of his friends, named, it just avoided my mind right now, so I'll just let it go. One of his friends sends him a letter and says, should we deal with these guys? How do we deal with them? What should we do with this situation that's unfolding? And he's like, I don't want to. I just want to write my books and be happy in my little cloister here. Because he saw that his problem was pride. And so how do you eliminate pride? You humble yourself. You go away and don't allow yourself to become famous. So he's this greatest speaker, probably around, one of the greatest, most popular speakers. He doesn't want to become famous. But they make it so. And he says, what we have here is a wound in Christ's own flesh. These people are festering. He said, what happened is the persecutions happened and they were never dealt with. The horror of the persecution was never dealt with. And now you've got a church that is festering with sickness. It's festering like an infection. He says, this needs to be dealt with. And he says, each man, though, needs to stand for themselves. Each minister. We are not saved as a corporate so that it is only apostolic succession, but each person stands before Christ alone. And so he makes these declarations. We talked about a little bit at the beginning, these little things that of course that's the way it should be, but nobody had ever said it before. It says baptism is not actualized because of the baptizer's faith. Just because Mark baptized you doesn't mean, and he falls into sin, doesn't mean that you lose your baptism. It's not because of your leader. You're baptized because you believe in Christ, and it's an outward sign, although they put force behind it back then. And then he makes this comment. He says, thieves everywhere prey upon the innocent, and the Donatists are a den of thieves. He comes in rather hard, using his tongue with witty lines, because the Donatists, you see, they try to act like they're innocent. We're not the persecutors. We're the one who's been persecuted, right? We're kicking away. We're the holy ones. But what do? They're coercing people. They're beating people up in the streets. They're kicking out pastors. Anybody who disagrees with them are being shouted down. How is this the attitude of somebody who is the innocent victim? They claim their clergy are irreproachable and their laity are uniformly pious. These are quotes from Augustine as he describes them. The attitude of people who see themselves as superior to others. See, he accused the Donatists of presuming that they were the pure ones by their name. You see, the idea is that the law is low, it's possible to be self-righteous. See, 1 John 1:8 says, if you say you have no sin, the truth is not in you. And he says, if you say you're pure, that you can live up to the law, that you can do everything perfectly, then you really don't understand your depravity. You don't understand that you've made the law simple. It's only external. It's not your heart. It's not your mind. It says if you look upon a woman to lust after her, you've committed adultery. It is not just a few physical acts. If you hold out against torture, you're okay. So mental toughness. You're making up a standard that is something that Christ never gave. And so he comes in rather harsh on them, far harsher than I think that most people today would. He says, cursed is the man who trusts in man. If you start thinking that you're going to hold against your morality and those around you is what's going to save you, you're not going to make it. You're cursed. It is God who gives the growth. He says, man waters, but God is the one who is actually going to give growth and give a growing of faith. In fact, in the Contra Cressonium, it's just a book that he has written, he says, it's comical to assume you can completely be purged of sin in this life. He actually starts making fun of it. It's comical to actually think that you can actually do that if you really understand how messed up we are in a lot of ways. We just fall. If you think that you've overcome, oh, I no longer do this anymore. Well, yeah, look at how strong I am. So you've replaced it with pride. You just keep replacing sins on top of each other. We're not saved. We're not holy because we're better than we've overcome always our sin. We've done it because Christ has declared us holy and said, when he looks at us, we're righteous. And he makes that distinction. Now, does that mean we aren't supposed to try? No, we're supposed to be holy as God is holy. We're supposed to do the best we can. But Christ is our holiness. And then he came and said, I need to discipline their pride. This is not what he did with other groups. But he says, how do you deal with pride? You have to humble. That is how, in their mind, you do the opposite. If a person has a problem with following around and hunting after the ladies, well, cloister them away. Become a monk. That's how they thought. You address the issue head on. You have to humble yourself. So he said, you guys have a problem with pride. You need to be humbled. Whoops. That's not this time. So what he did was he told the governor came up to him and said, how should I deal with these people? They're causing problems. He said, they need to be brought down. They have stolen these churches. They have become schismatic. You know the difference between heresy and schism? Heresy is having an idea. They could still be part of the family and be a heretic. They can still call themselves Christians and want to be in the church. A schismatic is a person who says, I'm not part. I'm something else. I reject. And they start holding the church away. He says, they're not Christians. They're not part of us. And he says, but whatever you do, he actually said, do not punish them. I want you to correct them. You send in the army and you correct them. Meaning that the attitude of the soldiers was not to go in there and just beat people up, but arrest the leaders, take them out, remove them from their positions, like sending in the police in an occupation. And now we can talk. But they've already taken that step. They have already coerced people. Even if they're not the ones who say we're not beating people up, they were still coercing. Bullying people in a church is still a form of coercion. If a person disagrees with you and you must believe like I am, that's coercion. That's a bullying. That's no different than if you beat somebody up. You're intimidating them. And he said there's no difference. And so in this case, and you'll see this is the only time it's a little different. He says, you guys can send in the army. And so they did. They arrested the Donatists. And then said, well, what happened to the Donatists? He said, well, many thanked him. Why do you think they would thank him? Because they were afraid of their leaders. They were afraid of their leaders, and they thanked him. Not all of them. Donatism didn't end. It actually continued until the Muslims took over. But the majority of them came back into the Catholic faith. When the leaders were removed, he was thanked. And he actually writes that in his books, saying he wasn't expecting it, but they thanked him. Of course, he said there were those who maintained and those who got more loud. But he says you can only do so much, basically, because his point was not to question. Now, think of that as, how would you deal with the situation? See, Augustine got put in a really tough situation. Can you imagine being asked to deal with something like that and to give advice? You teach, but then at some point you got to send the police in. You know, if they're doing an occupation. Luther got stuck with a similar situation with the peasants' revolt. Like, if you ever heard about that, is that haunted him his whole life. That he said you have to obey your leaders. You can't just rebel against them and do whatever you want. And then the prince just asked him, what do we do? These people have started a revolution. What do we do? He says, you got to put them down. You can't let schism form. It's a festering schism. Once people separate, it's something that's serious. And it is one of the hardest things. They say there's a difference. Schism is hard. Now, just think about that when you talk about denominations. Yes, we have denominations. Are we one family? Or are we separate? Are we schismatic? I actually don't think the Protestants were truly schismatic. They didn't want to completely say we are no longer part of the church. They said, we are protesting what's happening, and then they were apostatized. Is that the word? Apostatized. They were kicked out. There was a difference. Officially kicked out. The Protestants didn't leave. And I think that's an attitude that we have to realize sometimes when we talk about the Roman Catholics, is that they are still family. I know that might be kind of harsh, but they've never said that we're not family. We're Protestants, and they have disagreements. But sometimes we got to remember that according to the view, we might have really serious difficulties with them. I have gone both sides of whether or not they're Christians or not. Kind of like the Seventh-day Adventists. I've gone the same way with them. But if a person calls himself Christian, then I think that we, like Augustine, we should remember that to separate somebody is serious in the kingdom of God. Really, really serious. And that our first and final response should be to always pull people back into the faith, not to push them away. Because it is the body of Christ, and it's not something that we should ever take as just an intellectual disputing. Now, you'll see this more when we discuss some of the other things that Augustine had to deal with, and we can understand his heart when we see in other things, but I don't want to talk about that today. I was going to stop right here, because he was actually thrown into the midst of 3 controversies at the same time. At the same time. And we talk about them in theology books. But this is the one that he actually was the only one, he said, even though it wasn't even the biggest one, was the one that he said, we have to deal with force.
I have questions.
Do you have any questions?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, so we're pretty familiar with the Donatists in our Baptist church history that we grew up with. A little bit different than the traditional London Baptists and those sites. So I'm curious, is your primary complaint against the Donatists and the Novatians because we all want a high standard for the clergy, right? We want pastors. That was a big issue with the Catholic Church, right? Was they were pretending to be celibate, but then going out and living that very sexual life. Augustine was very notorious for, let me go ahead and sow my wild oats before I become a minister and whatnot. So we want to hold them to a high standard, but is our primary frustration with them the legalism and, that hypocrisy? Is that the primary?
The schismatic nature, when they were saying that we are different than other believers, that we're separate. That schismatic nature is what the early church had a problem with. They said everything else, you can sit there and preach against pride. You can preach against bad doctrine. You can preach against, and actually, we'll talk about the Arians. The Arians got to almost 60% of the entire church.
Wow.
The minister who baptized Constantine was an Arian.
Wow.
But yet they never ever moved against Arians because it was a theological issue. It wasn't in the same camp. But the Donatists, on the other hand, were schismatic. They didn't want to be part of the family, so you're not talking to them. You can sit there and have a problem with your brother and sit there, like a doctrinal. St. Nicholas punched Arius in the face, right?
Awesome.
But he never went around killing them after.
Great.
There's arresting them after. He didn't get all his elves to hunt them down. I love crossing the traditions on that. But,
I like that. Cool.
Yeah, so it's that schismatic nature that was the issue. Pride is an issue, and that's the issue with, you see, I had a section, maybe I mixed it in with another group here, but I had a section where we talked about the church itself. They had rules that were very strict. You know that if you miss church 3 times in a row, then you can't go to baptism. They had rules. You would be on the verge of being kicked out of the church if you missed 3 Sundays in a row.
Wow.
As an example, that was an early church belief, not just thievery and adultery and apostasy and those things. They had very strict rules that everyone, including Augustine and Cyprian, these people believed. Did I answer that correctly or fully?
Oh yeah. It was good to hear it in this perspective too, because grew up hearing lots of positive things about the Donatists and how a lot of Protestant and evangelical churches today inherited a lot of their doctrine, like not venerating martyrs or saints. We don't really do that.
They did, though.
They did?
Very strongly. The Donatists did?
Really?
Oh, yeah, because they were all about the glorification of the martyrs. It was the exact opposite. If you look at any of their writings, they were all about the martyrs.
But to venerate them and like to put them as saints is what I mean, to kind of burn candles to them and whatnot.
Well, they still did their holidays.
Okay.
Just like everyone else. I'm pretty sure North Africa was very much into the veneration of it wasn't veneration. They held to the holidays where they would have the death days of martyrs, and they would maintain that. That's why they had the confessors. They had those who overcame as well. They were the overcomers. And so there was a veneration in the positive sense, just a respect of those who did not give in to torture.
But not to the level where they're almost deistic, like praying to the saints, praying to Mary.
No, that was later too.
Right.
A lot of that stuff didn't fully get developed until about the 1200s. That was much later. That's the Lateran Council. What is it? The Fourth Lateran Council, where a lot of that stuff actually comes in. There was some stuff that happened with about. See, I wasn't ready to talk on this, but in like I think it's the 800s or something like that, where there's some Mary, but that has to do with Jesus became too holy. See, the idea I said about the Godfather family is that you don't go directly to the Godfather when you have, if he could be mad at you because you sin. If the Godfather's angry at you, you get a horse in your bed, right? He's not going to be good to you. So then you had to go to his mom, because his mom might be the soft one. She's the one who will forgive me. And so it was more of that's how you get in is you have to go through the side door to get in with the holy God. That was where the veneration of Mary kind of came from. It was that concept of that family.
They were also, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
They were, from what I understand, they were also famous for rebaptizing because they didn't accept.
Oh, the Donatists, yes. Because they were
didn't-
rejecting the entire Catholic Church and the apostolic succession.
Well, and also the christening, right? The baptizing of the babies, the infant baptism. That was.
I didn't read anything on that, but I'm not.
And obviously, because they're so strong on their church authority, they didn't like the state involving in their affairs.
Well, yeah, that's because they hated all state, all government, because they were the persecutors. They always came from that mentality. It's kind of like, if you want to talk about, well, what is a governing characteristic of the Jewish people? It's the Holocaust. They will always refer, everything is the Holocaust. Even in the news, it's like, well, it's been so many years since the Holocaust. It's the center. Well, they saw the persecutions. It was the center of their societal memory. So everything referred to that. They were 3 generations removed from persecution, the Donatists. That's the crazy thing. 3 generations separate, but they still had that. They were becoming more rabid than their grandfathers on these issues, which I think is why I would say it's a festering wound. Nobody dealt with it, never talked about it. They didn't have, deal with the damage that it caused to the community, all the persecutions.
I just had a question about Eastern Orthodoxy, like, because the whole North Africa and like just trying to understand where that came in, and because it sounds like a lot of similar things, but I'm just not sure where it came from, where it branched off.
Well, Donatism did go, and the Novatianism, like those groups did actually have when the Muslims took over, I think it was in the 500s in North Africa, they did have some went to Eastern, like the Greek-speaking areas. The Eastern Orthodox is they're the Greek-speaking, the West being Latin-speaking.
Okay.
And it's going to create a division. That is one of the big disunity factors, is that after a while, people couldn't talk. There was very little communication. I think there's only one theologian who crosses somebody of Poitiers, but there was only one theologian. He was a Western theologian who talked in Greek Eastern language, and they call him, he's like the bridge, but nobody even tried. It started becoming a division. Nobody tried to reconcile anything. I think it's kind of like when you have a dysfunctional family, and you've had the parents have been killed off, and you got orphans. Eventually, they stop. They don't know how to function as a family, and so the church kind of started growing into East and West. They didn't even really want to get along. They just kind of went their own way, spoke different languages, used different philosophies. The East having deification, being united with Christ as in your character, as the goal. And in the West, it was the crucifixion of suffering with Christ. And so they each went their way. But they're different philosophies. I actually think there's a lot of really good things to learn from the Eastern Orthodox Church. They're like some of I actually think their governance, the way that they view the church, is really interesting. I've looked at it, and everything I love about it, I just love it, is that their idea of, I don't know, it's like popcorn. The church is, it's not, we kind of have this institutional church where we kind of think of the church as a solid mass. It's something that has buildings, and their view is more, as long as there is good governance, that the leaders show up and they do what they're supposed to, then the church is alive and full. And so it's a different concept, the church including, the building and everything, but it requires good leadership in order to be a church. It's kind of a different idea. I don't know, that's an aside. Anybody else have any questions?
So, at the time, like the time that we covered today, what was the understanding of the word Catholic? Because you mentioned the Catholic Church a couple times, but it's kind of a different.
It's not Roman Catholic.
Right.
This is Catholic meaning universal.
Right.
And it just meant, it was the majority of believers. The Donatists were always a minority. But the reason why I link them, some people don't link them, the Novatianists and the Donatists. I link them because it's the same people and the same ideas. And when I was looking, a number of historians were doing that. They said they're so uniformly the same. They're just exactly the same in theology and using the same Bible passages. So that's one thing I like to do, is even when I look at groups that are considered heretic, I want to study what they taught and use and think through what is it that they're arguing for. Because usually they're not that weird and wacko. You know, one of the groups that I think that probably has gotten the worst beating, they're wrong, but they're wrong because they were asking the questions, and it was just early, was the Arians. I actually think they took far more of a beating in some people's nowadays than if you actually think what they were truly teaching. They had a problem that says, Jesus on the cross, what? Who died? Because God can't die. That's really the whole base of Arianism. Who died on the cross? A lot of that stuff wasn't worked out yet. They hadn't figured out the deity. And so, because if you got God, and you've got God can't die, because that is an immutable nature of who God is God cannot die. Right? And then, well, humans can die. And when a human dies, according to the Greek mindset, they're nihilistic, right? So there is nothing left. And so God cannot die. So God had to depart him. And so Jesus in his flesh died, but God could not. And that led to the whole downward spiral in all sorts of Bible passages. You wouldn't believe how many Bible passages they have to back up their view, going right to the Old Testament. They actually have a lot of Bible view. I mean, yeah, they didn't understand of the dual nature, and we talk of the hypostatic union and all that stuff that they had to come up with in order to prove this stuff. But they had to come up with new doctrines in order to deal with it.
Right.
Anybody else? If you have questions about these things, I know sometimes I like to get more and tell the story of it. I know that's not always the way it's taught, but I see history as more of this progressive flowing of people. And I try to understand the people, and sometimes I don't present it in a way where I'm kind of defending the person. You know, when I went through this the last 10 times when I'm going through and talking about how I try to give the positive of the Donatists, and I think I presented it this morning more negative. But I was trying to give it a positive to try to show that this is something that people can very easily fall into. But
That was great.